first speaker today will be Bill Birnes. Bill Birnes is a friend of mine. He's spoken at, I believe, almost every Pennsylvania conference that we've held since the Bucks County flap in 2008. And as a matter of fact, the first conference that we held in Pennsylvania, we drew 600 people. It was probably the largest conference that any single day has drawn, and Bill Birnes was one of the speakers at that. I think you all know Bill. Bill's a doctor and a lawyer and a publisher. He's been the host of UFO Hunters and appeared on Ancient Aliens, Unsealed, and a host of other shows. So really doesn't need an introduction, but today's first speaker is a friend of mine, Bill Birnes. Okay. Thank you, Bill.
Hi, folks. How are you? They had some audio and equipment issues, so I was supposed to be at 10:30, but I'm going to do today. I'm really happy to be here, and I thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back at a MUFON Symposium. We in the UFO community obviously are mourning the death of Roger Lear, who was a really good friend of mine. He was a guest on UFO Hunters. I'd known Roger for years, and so that was very sad that somebody of Roger's caliber, he was a doctor, he was a surgeon, an experiencer, and Roger had gone to Turkey. He'd filmed that UFO in Turkey, and he was a guest on my radio show, Future Theater, which airs Monday nights at 8 o'clock. He was a guest on my radio show numerous times, and we had a fabulous episode, the second episode of UFO Hunters in Season 1, when Roger actually on camera performed an extraction of an alien implant. And when we took that implant, and this is not what I'm talking about, but when we took that implant to SEAL Labs in California, and of course John Rao has had the same experience, what we found out is that there was a piece of this implantee's flesh growing out of the metal implant. Growing out. And the doctors at SEAL Labs, the metallurgist, because he was examining the metallic composition of this implant, he couldn't believe it. He said, human flesh does not grow out of metal. So we're skeptical, right? We're saying, no, it's just stuck. It's stuck there. And he said, no, you don't understand. The flesh is growing out of the metal. That doesn't happen on this planet. That doesn't happen in human beings. So Roger really was one of the people who made the series work in that first season. People were astonished about that. Piece of news, obviously, we're hoping for Stan Friedman, who had a heart attack. Stan Friedman's full recovery. I think he had a stent implant. I'm not sure. I spoke to Kathy Martin about it. She was on our show. And just best wishes to Stan Friedman for a real speedy recovery. And the other piece of news for everybody who's looking happily at Medicare and Social Security, James Garner died last night in California. Yeah, he died last night in California. Jim Rockford, Brett Maverick, James Garner, for folks who troll the Netflix and Amazon Prime and places like that, and like to rent videos. James Garner was one of the stars of probably one of the, in my top 5 war movies. James Garner was in this movie called The Americanization of Emily, which was written by probably one of our best screenwriters, Patty Chayefsky. One of the best war movies. So if you get a chance, if you see this movie on Netflix, you see it on YouTube maybe, download the movie. It's well worth it. I was really impressed the other day when I was listening to James Fox. I thought he gave a fabulous presentation. We wish him the best of luck on raising the finances for his new motion picture. And one of the things that impressed me was a couple of things. We did 2 of the episodes that James was talking about in his new movie, the Rua Zimbabwe episode, but also, which I found fascinating, was the Lonnie Zamora episode. And I'm just going to spend a couple of seconds on that and then go into the main point that I wanted to make, because the Lonnie Zamora episode feeds into what I'm talking about today. The focus, one of the themes of this symposium is UFOs in the media. And James raised the issue yesterday. One of the most amazing things about the human experience, that we, human beings on planet Earth, are encountering creatures, whether from another planet, another solar system, or another dimension, or another time. We go back and forth wandering in our lives, and people around us, including ourselves, but people around us are seeing orbs, they're seeing strange craft, they're taking videos and photos, and now in the age of cell phone cameras are actually capturing these things. A lot of them aren't UFOs, probably 95% are not, but still that small 5% are. Why isn't this the single biggest story? Why is it that people don't care? And my case in point, to pick up on what James Fox said the other day, is the Lonnie Zamora story. Here's a case where a Socorro, New Mexico police sergeant, and you all know this story, so I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing. He's chasing a speeding car. He sees this object. It's in the distance. He sees these strange short figures standing by. It takes off. And he's pretty shaken by it. He doesn't know what it is. So he calls it in, and he goes to the spot, and he's, as James said, he's seeing impressions in the sand. And this is hard desert sand. This is scrub, chaparral, hard desert sand at that location. Air Force officers show up. The FBI investigates this thing. They have soil sample experts on the site. So one of the things we did, and this is how we approached it. This is why UFO Hunters was different from shows like UFO Files and in some cases Ancient Aliens. And so I've written for Ancient Aliens as well. I know what the premise was. One of the things we did on UFO Hunters was we never tried to prove, never's the wrong word, we sought not to prove that UFOs existed, that an event was really a UFO event. We did just the opposite. And I'm writing this in this second UFO Hunters book, and I brought some with me to show you, that our premise was that given all the debunker and skeptical arguments, and most UFO researchers, everybody out here is probably a skeptic. Somebody comes to you with a story, and you will find ways to say, well, how does that work? And how did this work? And you saw a UFO. Where was it going? What was the direction? How high was it? What was the cloud? What was the sky like? Did it make a noise? What was your impression? What were the colors? I mean, you know, we all ask the same questions. Look at the MUFON star reports, and you could see what MUFON does with this. Well, what we sought to do is, the way I wrote the show, was we took the arguments that debunkers raised, and in particular the Lonnie Zamora case, but Rendlesham Forest and Maury Island and even Roswell. We took the arguments that debunkers raised, and since I'm a rabid Sherlock Holmes fan, what we did was we said in the first Sherlock Holmes book, which it's free, it's on Gutenberg, download it. by Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, well, Conan Doyle obviously said, examine every possibility of a case and eliminate everything you can eliminate. Dispose of whatever you can eliminate. What's left is what you investigate. And that was the premise. And that's the premise of a lot of the books I read about UFOs. Go after the arguments that explain something and then eliminate what you can eliminate. And that's basically the premise of what we did. So let's take the case that James Fox raised, the Lonnie Zamora case. The debunkers dumped on poor Lonnie Zamora. Oh, he's some drunken guy. What does he know? He didn't know what he was seeing. Some old tank of a cop. What did he know? Well, everybody looks in the other direction from the absolute physical evidence. So the president of one of the New Mexico Institute colleges, after the event, you all know who Dr. Linus Pauling is, the guy who vitamin C therapy and very famous doctor. He writes, I think this person is Colgate was his last name, writes to the president of this institute and says, say, what about that strange UFO case this Socorro police officer saw? And the president of the New Mexico Institute says, oh, no, that was a prank. It was a joke. Some of our crazy students were setting off rockets out there in the desert, and they fooled this cop. Like they knew a police officer was chasing a speeding car right when they were doing it. So he dismisses the whole thing. But the evidence, the physical trace evidence that was examined. First of all, the Birnes scrubbery, the Birnes scrub brush, right? So something was clearly there. The impressions in the sand, something was clearly there. But here's something else. Supposedly, these pranksters were set up an explosion that melted the sand. Now, that's something you can test, right? That's something you can go after. They melted the sand into glass. What does it take to melt sand into glass? Luckily, as it happens, my stepson's a glass blower. So I asked him, what kind of temperature would it take to fuse desert sand into glass? And he said, you've got to be up. First of all, you've got to be up in the range of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. You've got to do it for a while. And you've got to make sure that the glass that you fuse is purely fused, not just pieces of glass here and there, but real glass. Well, that's what was on the ground, where this object, Lonnie Zamora said that object took off. So let's go after the glass story. So we examined every possibility. What if the kids who were doing the prank fused the glass in a furnace and brought the glass to the site as a hoax? Well, asked my son again, and he said, you know, here's the problem with that. The composition of the glass in the ground, if that doesn't, it has to comport with the glass that's already there. Sure enough, the person examining the soil found out it was the exact same sand composition in the glass that was on the ground. So that whole argument about these kids setting off an explosion and it fused the glass into sand into glass, false. So that big argument about what these kids were doing did not eliminate the fact that the trace evidence showed the heat from the object that Zamora said he saw was greater than what they could have done in an explosion. And that was kind of the premise of a lot of the things we did on UFO Hunters. Find the skeptical arguments, find the debunker arguments, and test them out. The other thing was the Rendlesham Forest case, where a whole slew of debunkers, Ian Redpath was one of them, said, oh, those crazy American soldiers, boy, those Air Force guys, they saw the Orford Ness lighthouse, and they thought it was a UFO. How stupid could these guys be? Well, so that's the first question you asked Charles Halt, who was the deputy base commander who led his security team through Rendlesham Forest following the light. Let's set everything else aside for a second and just focus on that one argument. They never saw a UFO. They saw the beam from the Orford Ness lighthouse. You all know the Rendlesham story. I'm not going to repeat this story. You've read Peter Robbins' books. You've read the story of Larry Warren. You've heard it on the radio, so you know the story. Well, how do you test years later whether it was the Orford Ness lighthouse or whether it was something else? We don't know what it was, something else. Well, one way to do it is, what would Sherlock Holmes do? There's a beam from the lighthouse that supposedly is playing through the forest. A bunch of Air Force security personnel are chasing that beam. It goes to a clearing, a farmhouse clearing. And in the clearing, Charles Halt says, it breaks into 5 lights and disappears. Okay. Could they have seen the lighthouse beam from the clearing? There's your issue. That's the issue. From an evidentiary point of view, could they have seen the lighthouse beam from the forest looking into the clearing? And remember, the Air Force personnel could not go onto private property, and they were carrying weapons. They're carrying weapons in a royal forest. They weren't allowed to do that. So, number one, what would Sherlock Holmes do? He'd go to the lighthouse, and he'd ask the lighthouse keeper, say, Mr. Lighthouse Keeper, could your beam play in the forest? Well, what's the first thing we found out from, the guy's name was Seaman. What did he say to us? There was a bar across the base of that lighthouse that prevented the beam from traveling across the land. Specifically, the lighthouse beam could never have reached the land because it was blocked by a metal beam. That's one. But that wasn't good enough. Let's say a piece of that beam, light coming over the beam, was playing through the forest. So Charles Halt and our special effects producer, John Tyndall and Ted Ackworth, laid out the GPS waypoints where Halt said, with his own eyes, he saw the light. Then we measured where the Orford Ness lighthouse was, and we built a scale model, directly to scale to comport with the distances and the GPS waypoints that we took in the clearing. Sure enough, here was the light. There would the Orford Ness lighthouse beam have shown 2 different spots. So whatever light they saw in that forest, it could not possibly have been the Orford Ness light beam. Final little nail in that coffin of that debunker theory. Had the people at RAF Bentwaters ever seen the lighthouse before? Of course they had. They saw it from the runways. So if they're on the runway, remember this is an Air Force base, a NATO Air Force base. Standing on the runways, they could see the lighthouse beam over there. So they knew what the lighthouse beam looked like. They knew what the color was. It certainly wasn't orange. They knew what the color was. They knew the sequence for that beam playing through the sky. They'd have to know that because they're flying planes in and out of that place. Then there was one more. Our guest, in addition to Charles Halt, was Gary Hazeltine. Gary Hazeltine, in addition to writing the UFO police reports in the United Kingdom, also was an RAF security officer, an RAF policeman basically is what he was, like a military policeman, air police. That was his job in the RAF. And he said to us, RAF Bentwaters was a nuclear weapons base. NATO was storing nuclear weapons on an Air Force base in the United Kingdom. Because they were storing nuclear weapons there for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there was a sentry in a watchtower high above the base. And we were standing in the watchtower. If you see the episode, you could see us up in the watchtower. The sentry in that watchtower saw the entire event play out over RAF Bentwaters and over Rendlesham Forest. The lights coming in, and he's an eyewitness to the whole event. Never came forward publicly, but he was an eyewitness to the whole event. And it turns out radar picked up the objects. So instead of proving, yes, it was a UFO from somewhere else, we went after the debunker arguments to show that the debunker arguments didn't work. The evidence was against them, so therefore it had to be something else. What was the premise of all this? Why were we doing this? And why is it that in the face of absolute logic, evidentiary logic, why is it the media never picks up on this? Why is it that you have all these cattle mutilations in these western states, the media doesn't pick up on it? Why is it that you have a photo of a cow's body with a human head that was excised from sections out of a mutilated cow lying on the side of the road in New Mexico in Dulce? Nobody picks up on this thing. Well, I'll tell you who picked up on it. The pharmaceutical companies who went crazy because it was one of their experiments. So why is it? Here's why. So this is the answer to the question that James Fox raised yesterday afternoon, and it's this. And this applies all across the board, all across the board. There is something called the Overton window. Many of you will know that the Overton window is a title of a novel written by Glenn Beck, okay? It was his attempt to write the next Atlas Shrugged. The Overton window, it was developed by this professor, Joseph Overton, at the Mackinac Research Institute for Political Policy, and it basically says this. It's not a complicated theory. It basically says this, that there is a window, a framework. Inside the framework, certain news, political policy is acceptable. Outside that window, outside that framework, it's not acceptable. It's that simple. The other part of that theory is that the Overton window isn't static, it's dynamic. It shifts. So, for example, let's look at the spectrum of media, okay? I'll give you some examples from outside the world of UFOs so that you could see how this thing works. You look at Fox on the right, MSNBC on the left, and kind of in the middle are network news, the three major network news organizations, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN. So if you look at the types of stories that fall into those windows, you could see how that window shifts depending upon the political leanings of that particular network news organization. So, for example, Michelle Bachmann reads in a right-wing blog, and this is not a political presentation, I'm just giving you examples. Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann reads in a political blog, somebody wrote this, that when President Obama went to India, they were spending $2 million a day. Well, they weren't, but that's what she says. That is a major story that falls right through the Overton window, dead center, right across the plate on Fox. MSNBC debunks the whole story. Didn't happen, here's where it came from, blah, blah, blah. Different organizations have different parameters of the Overton window based on their political bent. Just last night, and here's one of my major stories. Just last night, CNN was airing, because it's the anniversary, July 17th was the anniversary of the crash of TWA Flight 800 off Long Island. And Fox ran the special, not Fox, CNN ran the special Witnessed. Now, I happen to have a personal relationship with that story, because while I was setting up the Phil Corso book Day After Roswell at Simon & Schuster, while we were doing that, somebody that a good friend of mine that I'd worked with for years, James Sanders, was writing, and I was editing that book, so I was very intimate with that story. He was on the road, basically hiding from the FBI, trying to stop him from writing the book. Big brother, right? So he's writing this and sending me chapters, and I'm rewriting and editing the chapters and sending them back to Kensington, who's our publisher. Well, it turns out that what they were doing was they were manipulating the evidence at the Calverton hangar for a mechanical theory for an explosion of the center wing tank. The center wing tank did explode, ultimately, in that plane. But depending upon which news organization, CNN, in the early hour or so after the news was reported about the crash, CNN pops up and says, and the Navy denies shooting down the plane. Well, do you remember Colombo? When somebody says to Colombo, Colombo, I never shot that guy. And Colombo says, hey, wait a minute. Nobody accused you, and how do you know the guy was shot? So when the Navy says, we didn't shoot down that plane with one of our missiles, wait a minute, nobody said you shot down the plane with a missile. Why are you exonerating yourself from a crime nobody accused you of? That sets Sanders, who was a SEAL Beach, he was a medically retired a police officer at SEAL Beach, whose job was, get this now, a crash scene analyst. If you all know California, you know that the 405 runs straight through SEAL Beach. It's a nightmare road. Jim Sanders worked that beat as a crash scene analyst. And he begins to look at all the reports as they're coming out. Second part of this thing. When you are and I write a lot of books about serial killers and mass murders. I'm a true crime writer, a psychology true crime writer. And so when you look at a lot of these crimes, and I worked, for the Department of Justice, I've worked for the DEA in cold cases, doing computer analysis. When you look at the crimes, a series of crimes, where you go to in a crime series is the earliest crimes, because the best clues, the most apparent clues are in the earliest crimes. So Sanders immediately goes to the debris field analysis that the NTSB is putting out. Sure enough, he sees parts of the plane, like the number 3 engine on the right wing, going into the water first. Then he sees seats from the business class. This is 747, so there's obviously first class, business class, economy class. He sees those seats in business class going into the water next. And he reads the Suffolk County Coroner's report on the injuries suffered by the business class passengers in that row 17. They have injuries, broken neck injuries. It's called coup counter coup, which means the necks are broken that way, which means the force came in that way. So, by the way, that's one of the clues to the Kennedy assassination mystery, because his head is going the wrong way for a shot from the rear, but that's a whole other story. So Sanders says, how is it that these injuries show an impact from the right side of the plane? And the right number 3 engine, closest to the fuselage, falls in the water first, then the seats with the passengers, then the rest of the plane begins to break up. The plane tilts over on its left side because the right wing is gone, so it can't fly. Can you imagine what's going on in that plane? Yeah, think about it. It was not an explosion immediately. The plane is still flying over like this on its side. The pilot's frantically trying to right that plane in some way to bring it down on the water. Well, suddenly, Sanders gets in FedEx a piece of cloth from the rear seat, and there's a red streak across it. Looks very suspicious. Takes it to a lab, and they say, oh, that's the residue from a solid fuel rocket that the Navy uses. Morton Thiokol makes that propellant for the Navy. Goes to Morton Thiokol. Yeah, that's our thing. FBI goes bonkers. Bonkers. Sanders cuts off a piece, sends it to CBS News. The FBI raids CBS News. Raid CBS News. Okay. I'm not going to go into years later, by the way, so that just to put a cap on this and explain why it works with UFO stories. Years later, we get an affidavit. I think I have it somewhere. An affidavit from the TWA legal team. TWA is out of business now. That crash was the death knell for TWA. We get this affidavit. TWA lawyers in an affidavit, a sworn affidavit, say that the FBI manipulated debris from the crash scene for a pre-set up theory that it was a mechanical disaster, that the center wing tank blew up on its own. Like a 747 that's in service for something like 35 years, suddenly one 747 blows up from a center wing tank that never happened before and never happened after. They manipulate the evidence. Then, in a FOIA request from the Navy admits, they admit this. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we were having what's known as a cooperative engagement exercise, a CEC, exercise that night off Long Island, off the south shore of Long Island, and that meant they did this in response to the USS Vincennes in the Persian Gulf shooting down an Iranian commercial airliner. You all remember that story. We're all old enough to remember that story. And this will tie into what I'm talking about at the Overton window. So the Navy, knowing what it did, figures out a way to, in a busy air passage, air conduit area, lots of land clutter, lots of air traffic, lots of things, to develop a cross-hatching radar setup to allow a naval vessel, in this case it was the Sea Wolf that was being sea tested, she wasn't yet commissioned, to shoot down an incoming missile aimed at United States ships or a plane. So the Navy admits they had a drone that night flying over Long Island. And the premise was the Sea Wolf in brown water, she was submerged, gets a radar signal that's distinguished and fires a missile at the drone. The missile supposedly brings down the drone, and that was what the Navy was working on. Unfortunately, because of heavy thunderstorms in Chicago that delayed the connecting flight to Kennedy, Flight 800, due to take off at one point, takes off a half hour later. Nobody knows the facts from the Navy saying that the military operation area, the MOA, W104, Whiskey 104, was hot, which means no air traffic can go through at a certain level, right? Above it you can, below it you can't, was hot. They never got the, they didn't get the memo. They take off from Kennedy, the Navy fires a missile, Flight 800, the 747 is climbing at 13,000 feet. The missile is semi-active radar, picks up the plane, homes in, its heat seeker turns the missile around, hits the number 3 engine, blows off the right wing, and that's how the plane is brought down. Witnessed by multiple witnesses. People sitting in Shinnecock Bay, people on the water, fishermen on the water. Well, that is unacceptable to the Navy and to the White House. So they cover up the story. Now, the news organizations are pressured to go with that story despite absolute evidence. In fact, years later, CNN actually is still debunking the missile story. Last night, Witnessed was on the air and literally eliminating the solid evidence and going with the FBI theory, where there's no evidence for, oh, there were explosives on the plane because the plane was tested over for explosive for bomb-sniffing dogs. Wrong. It was another plane that was tested in the next gate. I mean, absolute lies. But because the Overton window specifically eliminates conspiracies, you can't have a conspiracy in the Overton window unless it's a sex scandal. So therefore, that is outside the Overton window, and the story is manipulated by the media to give the FBI story credence, which it never has from an evidentiary point of view. I'm going to insert one piece of news since I brought up Jim Sanders. Here's the piece of news. You all know, because you're all experienced UFO researchers, you all know about the Condon report, right? He's the dean at University of Colorado, and you all know from having read descriptions of that report, many of you have read the report itself, it's available, you can download it, that the people at the University of Colorado, remember, the University of Colorado, Dean Condon, Edward U. Condon, Dean Condon was tasked by the Air Force with coming up with supposedly a quote-unquote scientific investigation of UFOs, with the premise, were UFOs something worthy to be investigated? If they're worthy to be investigated, did they pose a threat to the national security of the United States? Nothing wrong with that. The people doing the analyses, among the pieces of information analyzed were the Rex Heflin photos, which James McDonald analyzed, Professor McDonald, the Rex Heflin photos. And they said, yeah, there is solid evidence here that would indicate we should investigate this phenomenon further. Dean Condon writes an executive summary completely denying what's in the report. Oh, UFOs, it's nothing. It's hallucinations. It's delusions. It's nothing here. Move along, nothing to see here. No threat to national security. Forget about it. Then Professor Michael Swords, out in Michigan, has in his hand a letter from the Air Force telling Condon, we need you to dismiss the entire UFO theory. So it's supposed to be an independent investigation. The Air Force is telling Condon, no, we don't want any independent stuff. We want you to dismiss. You can all find the letter. It's online. Michael Swords put it up online. We want you to dismiss the whole UFO theory. It's out of the Overton window for the Air Force. And as James said last night, There are over 700 cases that are still unknown in Project Blue Book because we want to get out of the UFO business. We want to get out of Project Blue Book and close it down. You have to dismiss the UFO theory. So Condon does exactly that. And you wonder to yourself, I wonder to myself, why would Condon, a supposedly respected academic, independent academic, why would he just simply go along with what the Air Force said? Why would he do that? Did they pay him? Did they give him money under the table or something? Why would he do that? James Sanders comes up with the answer. I have it. I'll put it up online for you, so you can all download it. It'll be on the Future Theater website, the radio show website. And here's what it is. Jim and I are working on a book right now, one of the many books I'm working on. It's a book it's literally about how the United States became a national security state. And part of our theory is that there were a bunch of stumble bums in FDR's cabinet and then in Harry Truman's cabinet. By the way, when people scream there never has been full presidential disclosure of UFOs, wrong. In 1952, Harry Truman goes on radio in a press conference and says these words. This is after the July 1952 UFO flyover, the airspace invasion over Washington. Harry Truman says, "Oh, these are UFOs." Wow. Then he says, "We know what they are." That's disclosure. We've had it. We had it from Harry Truman, but the Overton window closed. You can find it online. You can find Harry Truman talking about it, but the Overton window is closed. That's never going to get through. No media is going to pick that up, even though a United States president admitted there were UFOs over Washington, D.C., and the government knew what they were. Okay, so we're researching this from the point of view, it's a political theory book about how we lost China, how we got into Vietnam, and we find out that the FBI was investigating a number of people involved. This is 1946. Truman just took office the year before, after FDR died. War's over, and the FBI, Hoover basically, I have the document. Hoover is investigating people involved with United States research, State Department science that have ties to the Soviet Union. Okay? One of the names that pops up on that list of communist sympathizers and operatives in the United States is Edward U. Condon. Use your detective theories now. Here's a guy who's tagged by the FBI as a communist, part of the Big Red Scare in the late 1940s and early 50s, part of the blacklist. How do you get out from under that? What do you do to get out from under that? You do exactly what the government tells you to do. Edward Condon, by the end of 1946 into 1947, when the National Security Act is passed, becomes a covert operative for the United States government to get himself out of being investigated for being a subversive, a communist. So when the time comes that the Air Force needs somebody to debunk UFOs, even though his own faculty says it's worth investigating, the Air Force can rely on somebody working for the government to do their bidding. That person is the author of the executive summary of what's come to be known as the Condon Report. Dean Edward U. Condon. And that literally, for me, that's a case closed. Okay, so that's one of the pieces of news that really links up with this whole Jim Sanders thing and this whole Overton window business. The other aspect of this is that Larry King, and James has been on Larry King, I've been on Larry King, Larry King is, because I've met him, he used to have breakfast when he lived in L.A. At this place called Nate Now's in Beverly Hills, and he'd be talking. He was fascinated by UFOs, fascinated by it. And this is why he had so many people on, and CNN allowed that to be on the air because nobody really is going to say no to Larry King. Okay, he's that big. But because the Overton window disallows any stories of UFOs, just disallows it. And here's another example of that. You cannot have a UFO story taken with any serious credibility on a major media. Here's another example, okay? I'll talk to Lee Spiegel about this myself later, but for example, when the Huffington Post handles a story like that, it's relegated to news of the weird. Because it's weird. It's not news. It's news of the weird. Rachel Maddow, MSNBC. I respect her. She does a good job covering the news, political theory notwithstanding. Rachel Maddow comes up with, she's laughing, doubling over with laughter, because she's talking about how Ronald Reagan said in front of the UN, if aliens came, we would put aside our petty differences and unite. And she's howling with laughter. Boy, what a nut. Boy, is he crazy. Why would he say that? Of course, he said it twice, didn't he? He said it in front of the UN, then he said it after the summit meeting with Gorbachev at Reykjavik, Iceland. Why would he say that? Why would Ronald Reagan say that? Here's what Rachel Maddow didn't cover. And when I wrote her about it, she never even answered me. Ronald Reagan had not one, but two up-close and personal UFO sightings. Sighting one, when he was governor of California, he was flying from Los Angeles to Sacramento. Over the Mojave Desert, they see a strange craft. So Reagan says to his pilot, this is the governor's plane, says to his pilot, chase that thing, follow that flying saucer. And he does. Plane diverts, goes out over the Mojave Desert to follow this strange object. Reagan is so impressed by it, and the object shoots over the Mojave Desert and disappears, faster than the plane. They land in Sacramento. Who's the first person Ronald Reagan talks to about this? Governor Reagan talks to about this? The Sacramento bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. He tells him the entire story. Well, I'm going to talk to Nancy about this. I mean, that's how excited he was about this. Years later, Nancy and Ronald Reagan are driving down, it's PCH, it's Pacific Coast Highway, California 1. They're driving down the Pacific Coast Highway because they are going to a surprise birthday party in Hollywood for the actor William Holden. Remember him face down in the swimming pool in the movie Sunset Boulevard, right? The news guy in Patty Chayefsky's network. Very famous guy, William Holden, great actor. Oh, remember him if you've ever seen the movie Our Town. He's the young 16-year-old kid in that one day when Emily gets to relive her life for one day. It's William Holden. Love is a many splendid thing, William Holden. They're having a birthday party for him. And the Reagans are driving down Pacific Coast Highway to go to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. And there are all these movie stars at this party. They see a UFO hovering over Pacific Coast Highway, goes out into Santa Monica Bay, goes underwater. UFO, USO. Reagan gets to the party. He tells everybody at the party, we saw a flying saucer. How do we know this? Who tells us this? None other but I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball, writes about it and says, Reagan told us, the governor told us about this UFO we saw over Pacific Coast Highway. So not one but two. So Rachel Maddow is doubling over with laughter about what Ronald Reagan said about UFOs. But she doesn't say that Reagan had 2 up-close and personal UFO sightings. Because that explains why he said to Gorbachev and why he said to the UN, what if aliens came from another planet, we'd all unite? You see, there's a causality here. But when you just laugh at the one thing, as most people do, because that's acceptable policy, Reagan, Otis, crazy guy from California, but he had 2 UFO sightings. Okay, so he's a conservative. Fine. You eliminate what he did because he's a conservative. Fine. But what about Jimmy Carter? You saw last night. James Fox captured it on video. Jimmy Carter admitted to a UFO sighting. And then if you talk to people like Danny Sheehan, who represented Dr. Mack at when they wanted to remove him from tenure because he was talking to people who said they had been abducted by aliens to get their medical stories, Danny Sheehan said that when Jimmy Carter was president-elect, he gets his briefings, right? When you're the president-elect, you get all these briefings as part of your transition. So Jimmy Carter asks the director of intelligence, head of the CIA. Remember who that was? In 1976, George H.W. Bush. So he asks Director Bush, can you please tell me what the CIA knows about UFOs? This is a witnessed meeting, by the way. This is not 2 guys in a closet talking. It's a witnessed meeting. And here's what Director Bush says to Jimmy Carter. Mr. President-elect, you have no need to know. But if you want to know, everything you're looking for is in the National Archives. So Alfred Labramont Weber of Exopolitics, we all know who he is, he tells me that after Carter took office, he tasked his director of domestic policy, Stuart Eisenstadt, who's now, I think, on the board of trustees up at Boston College or something, Stuart Eisenstadt, to come up with a protocol for alien contact. Where is this protocol going to be studied? At a very famous place, the Stanford Research Institute, under Harold Puthoff. Well, they're all beginning to study, and Weber says he's part of that group, and they're going to study it. Suddenly, a budget guy comes in from the Pentagon. This is according to Weber. Comes in from the Pentagon. And he says to the folks at SRI, say, you guys have a really big defense budget from us, don't you? We really fund you guys a lot. Let me ask you a question. Why would you be studying something that doesn't exist? Why would you be spending our money on something that's not real? If you're going to spend that on something that's not real, we'll just take the money away. Well, SRI has at least 30% of its money from the Pentagon. That threat shuts it down. So even though this was a White House initiative, it was shut down. one question I'd love to ask Jimmy Carter, if we're ever sitting in a green room together, is to ask him, say, Mr. President, is it true that Director of Central Intelligence Bush told you you had no need to know about UFOs? We all know you had a sighting because you actually filed a report on that sighting in Georgia. And A, and B, there is a story that after you said on the campaign trail that you would tell Americans the truth about UFOs, you'd release the files, some unnamed person walked into the Oval Office and said, that's the one thing you can never do. It would end your presidency, probably end your life as well. And he clammed up and talked to Grant Cameron, who writes about presidential UFOs about that, because he's the guy who told me that story. So, but you'll never hear that story. Jimmy Carter's on Jon Stewart. Jimmy Carter's on Bill Maher's Real Time. You'll never hear Bill Maher asking about UFOs. You'll never hear Jon Stewart asking about UFOs. In fact, when the time comes to talk about UFOs, when Annie Jacobson wrote this book, false on its face about Area 51. I mean, she starts a book by saying, well, Area 51 was named because it was established in 1951. Huh? We all know that what was to become a location that was never referred to as Area 51 except by those of us bandering it back and forth. Nellis Air Force Base, Groom Lake, Papoose Lake is not Area 51. That it was a gunnery range in World War II, federal land. And when Kelly Johnson was developing a spy plane, early U-2, for the CIA, they were looking for a location to develop that plane. And because you know what the U-2 looks like, the wings were so broad, it takes so long for this plane to take off, and they needed a spot with extra long runways. That was secret. They used that gunnery range near Nellis Air Force Base, out near Rachel, Nevada. The base was established, started to be established in 54, went operational in 1955. So it was not made a base in 1951. So why do they call it Area 51? Go look at the tax map for the state of Nevada. That parcel of land is number 51. So anybody can Google this. False on its face. Oh, wow, she solved the secret. Then she says, talk about your Overton window. So what, and she takes this huge diversion. Excuse me, this huge diversion. In the middle of this book on Area 51, she says, oh, here's the real story about Roswell. Here's the real story. I'll tell you the real story. Told to me in secret by one of the Area 51 workers. We did an episode on Area 51. I was at Area 51. I spoke to T.D. Barnes personally. She says that really Roswell was the Horton brothers flying wing, okay, with midgets. And the Air Force, well, the Army, believed that because this was a German weapon, we had to keep it secret. The war's over, dudes. It's over. It was over 2 years ago. Why are you keeping the secret of a Horton Brothers flying wing? Oh, it's a top secret aircraft. Folks, trivia test. Where was the first flying wing seen in public? What year do you think it was? First flying wing. Public. 1938. In 1938, or actually 1937, H.G. Wells wrote a movie called Things to Come, starring Raymond Massey. In that movie, what are these futuristic beings flying? Wings, flying wings. We had bombers in the early 1940s. Jack Northrop had a flying wing he proposed, but FDR hated his guts. He had a flying wing that was going to be a bomber. So we knew what flying wings were. Jesse Marcel, Major Marcel, would have absolutely known what a flying wing was. So the Horton brothers' flying wing would have been no mystery. Jesse Marcel and Jess Jr., who also died last year, said that there was exotic material in the debris field at Roswell, exotic material. What was the Horton brothers' flying wing made of? Wood. Wood. And what was its propulsion system? A jet. Had we seen jets before? Yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen, because the advanced Messerschmitts intercepting our B-17 bombers over Europe were jet-powered. So we knew about jets. Our intelligence had known there was a Horton brothers flying wing. The Horton brothers flying wing was made of wood. And the Germans, even though they had a big Junkers transport plane that supposedly was ferrying people to South America, they never had an intercontinental bomber during the war. Never. That's why they were flying V-1s and V-2s. So everything about that story, again, false on its face. But yet, the media went bonkers. Roswell explained a flying wing. Actually, the real worry about Roswell, which a nameless person from a three-letter agency once told me, was that we believed in the very first hours that it was a Japanese balloon bomb that was laced with anthrax, hence the secrecy about it. These were called fugus. I forget the actual Japanese name, but they were firebombs. They landed in the United States. The Japanese, during the war, were launching these balloon bombs over the Pacific, laced with anthrax and explosives, and some of them landed in places like Washington State, Oregon, and it was kept secret because we didn't want to let the Japanese balloon launchers know where their balloons were landing, because our media would then be artillery spotters for the enemy. That story of the Japanese balloon bombs and the secrecy, because this is not well known today, that story is part of CIA training at Langley to this very day about how we kept those balloon bombs secret. So that was one of the things. So, I mean, when you consider these things, and then years later, when the Air Force releases its big report on Project Mogul. By the way, that report, when the Air Force released that report about Project Mogul and then crash dummies, fabulous. They did it in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash in 1997. Incidentally, that was on the publication date of the day after Roswell. And it's the only time the New York Times has ever put a UFO story above the fold on its first page, because it debunked UFOs. I can walk you through, Stan Friedman is not here, so I can walk you through what Stan said about that whole story, but the point is flat out false, untrue. As Stan Friedman said on UFO Hunters, if that were a Project Mogul balloon, if that were crash dummies, they would have had to have sent that craft in a time machine back through time, because we didn't have those crash dummies until the early 1950s. And Project Mogul, the big balloon they said that it was, not until 1949. And the balloon factory making those balloons is right across the street from the Roswell Air Force Base, from Walker Field. Right across the field, right across the street. Who told us that? Earl Fulford, who was one of the people taking the memory medal from the debris field. So, I mean, these stories are, but that's what the media reports. Because the Overton window says flat out, anything but aliens. Here's my last example. I'm going to take some questions. Here's my last example. In 1997, thereabouts, Lady Bird Johnson released the Lyndon B. Johnson Oval Office tapes. So before Nixon, Johnson recorded conversations. Even Jack Kennedy recorded conversations. Those tapes are very revealing. I'm going to go back to MSNBC for a second. Tapes are very revealing. In one of those tapes, well, there are two conversations. This is also why, for me, Corso had some credibility. In the one conversation, it's the day, couple of days after the Kennedy assassination. Johnson is back, he's been sworn in, and he's in the Oval Office. So he has his meeting with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. Hoover, this is now on tape, Hoover says to LBJ, Mr. President, you know there are two Lee Harvey Oswalds. Now, Corso told me that before those tapes came out. He said that there was a Lee Harvey Oswald at the at an embassy in Mexico City, and the CIA knew about it. Okay, and Corso told me that. So Johnson says, "Yes, I know about that." Johnson says, "Yes, I know about that. But let's not tell Alan Dulles, shall we?" And Hoover agrees. Think of the implications of this. For the President of the United States and the nation's top federal law enforcement officer to agree to withhold information from what will be an investigation into the murder of a president. They are conspiring to obstruct justice after the fact in a capital murder case in Texas. Texas, that's a hanging offense. That's a capital offense in Texas. They're accessories after the fact to murder. Murder one, lying in wait. It's a death penalty offense in the United States, in certain states. It is in Texas to this very day. That's on tape. Now, did I have special access to these tapes? No. It was published in Newsweek magazine and Time magazine in the summer of 1997. But oh no, it's right in the face of the Warren Commission. The president is obstructing justice. Who covered this story? Absolutely no one. Michael Beschloss, writing about those tapes for Simon & Schuster, he's a presidential historian, simply eliminates that conversation from the book, Taking Charge. What happened? I read it in Time magazine. Now it's not in your book? Another conversation. The Warren Commission is now investigating the forensics, the ballistics of the shots fired at President Kennedy. Now, in that investigation of those shots, there is this thing called the magic bullet theory. A bullet supposedly from the book depository fired at Kennedy from the rear, goes through the president, hits his wrist, goes in midair, spins, and hits John Connally. Nobody believes it on the Warren Commission. Jerry Ford, Congressman Jerry Ford, who, by the way, in 1966, writes a letter to Mendel Rivers. This is after the Hilldale, Michigan sightings that Alan Hynek called swamp gas. I'll tell you an Alan Hynek story later. He says it's swamp gas. Jerry Ford is so incensed, he writes to Mendel Rivers and said, we better investigate this thing. It's only one of the first times in history the United States Congress investigates UFOs, or the Science Committee. Jerry Ford says, can't happen. Senator Richard Russell on the Warren Commission says, can't happen. LBJ picks up the phone and calls Richard Russell, Senator Russell. Who's on the other line working for Russell? Philip Corso. Told me the story before the book, told this to us at our first meeting with him, before it comes out in Time magazine. Picks up the phone and says to Russell this: I need you to agree to the single shooter, single bullet theory. Richard Russell says, Mr. President, not only I, but Congressman Ford will not do that, because we don't believe a bullet can do that. And here's what LBJ says. Senator Russell, if that bullet did not do what we need the Warren Commission said it had to do, that means there's another shooter. Another shooter means a conspiracy. If there's a conspiracy, and somehow we look at the Soviet Union, 40 million people will die in a bilateral nuclear exchange over the death of one man who's never coming back. What do you want? This is on tape. What do you want to do? Russell says, Mr. President, I will convince Jerry Ford to go with that single bullet theory. And what does Jerry Ford do? This is all documented. This is not some wacky conspiracy. This is all documented. What does Jerry Ford do? He changes the wound in Kennedy's back to be higher, and it's really an exit wound anyway, not an entrance wound, to be higher so the bullet's trajectory would hit Kennedy's wrist. So the Warren report is distorted to go along with what Johnson wants. It's astounding. You never, ever see that in the media. Now, how is this, where is the Overton window shifting on this? Last year on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow was talking about this one piece of tape that's released from the LBJ Oval Office tapes. Because now, remember, in the political framework of the Overton window, Nixon is the enemy because of Watergate. He's the enemy. So Johnson is complaining to one of his advisors that while he's negotiating a peace treaty with the North Vietnamese, this is 1968 now, to get us out of Vietnam, Richard Nixon calls the South Vietnamese ambassador and says, you wait till I'm president, you guys will get a better deal. Don't agree to a peace treaty now. This is like almost a decade before the collapse of South Vietnam. You agree with me, I'll get you a better deal. So a candidate for president goes around the president, negotiates a separate agreement with the South Vietnamese. Rachel Maddow, do I have more time? 1 minute? Okay. I'll sum it up. So Rachel Maddow quotes from that tape, quotes and plays that tape, but she'll never play the tape about the Kennedy assassination. Flash forward to 2013, Last statement, I'm talking to Paul Landis. Paul Landis was the Secret Service agent in charge of the Jackie Kennedy Protection Detail. We're writing the book Dr. Feelgood, which the Huffington Post first wants to review, reads the book, reads about the Kennedy assassination, and says, we're not touching this book. Talk about your Overton window. That's my Exhibit A. In it, Paul Landis tells us, oh, I was walking behind the Kennedy limousine. Jackie is on the left. The president is sitting to her right. I hear a shot. It's over my shoulder. It echoes through Dealey Plaza. I hear another shot. It comes from the front, and the back of Kennedy's head blows off. I testified to that. They told me to shut up. Quick questions, anybody? I can't see out there, so you're going to have to come up and scream. Can't do questions. So catch me later on. We can do questions. Sorry. Thank you, folks. Thank you.
We got the luncheon up there. Hey, the good thing with Bill is he's our Q.